What is the price of silence? For Julian Croft, a high-flying tech entrepreneur, it was $200 million. When he divorced his quiet, unassuming wife Emily, he saw it as cutting dead weight. He took the house, the savings, their shared history, and left her with almost nothing. She didn't fight, she didn't argue. She simply signed the papers and walked away in silence. 6 months later, a single announcement in Forbes magazine would not only shatter Julian's world, but expose a secret so vast it would make his entire life's ambition look like pocket change. This is the story of the silent wife he discarded, and the moment the world discovered she was an heiress to a fortune he couldn't even fathom. The silence in their Boston penthouse had become a physical presence as thick and suffocating as the coastal fog that often crept in from the harbor. It wasn't the comfortable silence of two people who knew each other's thoughts, but the vast empty space between two strangers who happened to share a mortgage. Emily Vance felt it most acutely in the evenings. She would be in her small studio, a converted sunroom overlooking the Charles River, the scent of turpentine and oil paint clinging to her clothes while her husband Julian Croft was in his home office, the rhythmic tapping of his keyboard the only sign he was even there. They had been married for 8 years. The first 5 were a whirlwind of shared dreams built in a cramped apartment with second-hand furniture and takeout cartons. Julian, with his razor-sharp ambition and charisma that could charm investors out of their life savings, was the engine of their life. Emily, with her quiet nature and steady job at the Boston Public Library's rare books department, was his anchor. She believed in him with a ferocity that often surprised even herself. She packed his lunches, proofread his business proposals, and celebrated every small victory as if it were the moon landing. Her modest salary kept them afloat while his first startup, a predictive analytics company called EtherTech, burned through cash. Then, EtherTech landed a massive Series A funding round led by the venture capital firm Sequoia Capital. Everything changed overnight. The cramped apartment was replaced by the penthouse. The takeout cartons were replaced by catered parties where Emily felt more like staff than the host. Julian's wardrobe shifted from worn-out sweaters to custom-tailored Tom Ford suits. His language changed too. He started using words like synergy, disruption, and burn rate in casual conversation. He stopped talking about our dream and started talking about my legacy. Emily tried to keep up. She traded her comfortable cardigans for designer dresses that felt like costumes. She tried to engage with his new friends, sleek, predatory men and women who sized you up by the watch on your wrist and the stock options in your portfolio. But she was an analog soul in a digital world. Her passions were the crisp scent of aging paper, the subtle shift of light in a Vermeer painting, and the quiet satisfaction of bringing a canvas to life with her own hands. These were things that couldn't be quantified, optimized, or monetized. In Julian's new world, they were worthless. The dismissal was gradual at first. He'd call her work at the library a cute little hobby. He'd glance at her paintings and say, "That's nice, Ellie," before immediately changing the subject to EtherTech's latest valuation. The final, sharpest cut came 6 months before the end. She had spent a year working on a portrait of him from their early days, capturing the hunger and hope in his eyes. She unveiled it for their anniversary, her heart pounding with a mixture of pride and vulnerability. Julian stared at it for a long, silent moment. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, recognition, perhaps even regret, before it was extinguished, replaced by a cool, appraising gaze. "It's good," he said, the word hanging in the air like a poorly executed note. "But it's not the right image. It's not who I am anymore. We need something more aspirational for this space. Something by a known artist. It's about brand alignment." He didn't see a gift of love. He saw a branding conflict. That was the moment Emily knew her husband was gone, replaced by the CEO of EtherTech. The man she had married was now just a ghost in a photograph she herself had painted. The woman who replaced her was named Savannah Sterling. Emily didn't know her name at first, only the signs of her existence. The scent of a different perfume on his suits, the late-night board meetings that stretched until 3 a.m., the way he guarded his phone as if it were a state secret. Savannah was everything Emily wasn't. She was the COO of a rival tech firm, a fixture on Boston's social scene, and she looked perfectly at home in the glossy pages of a magazine. Julian wasn't just having an affair. He was upgrading. The end came on a Tuesday. It was raining, a relentless, miserable downpour that matched the mood inside the penthouse. Emily was cataloging some newly acquired 18th-century manuscripts for the library, finding solace in the careful, precise work. Julian walked in not in his usual suit, but in expensive athleisure wear that screamed, "I just came from a session with my personal trainer." He didn't sit down. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a silhouette against the gray, churning sky. "Emily," he began, his voice devoid of any emotion. "This isn't working." She didn't look up from her work, her fingers tracing the faded ink of a long-dead poet. "I know." Her quiet acceptance seemed to unnerve him. He had clearly rehearsed for a fight, for tears, for pleas. He was prepared for a scene, not this heavy, resigned calm. "I've been thinking about it for a while," he continued, gaining momentum. "We've grown apart. We want different things. I'm on a trajectory that requires a different kind of partner, someone who understands the pressures, the networking, the world I live in." Someone like Savannah Sterling, Emily thought, but she said nothing. "I've spoken to my lawyer," he said, the words now coming quickly, clinically. "Marcus Thorne. He's the best. He'll draw up the paperwork. I want this to be amicable. Clean. I'm prepared to be generous." Emily finally looked up. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, met his. There was no anger in them, only a profound, bottomless sadness. "What is your definition of generous, Julian?" He shifted his weight, uncomfortable under her direct gaze. "I'll let you keep your car, and I'll provide a settlement, say $50,000, to help you get on your feet. Find a new place. It's more than fair, considering you haven't contributed financially in years." The cruelty of the statement was breathtaking. The years she worked to support them, the inheritance from her parents she had poured into his first failed venture, the emotional labor of holding their life together, all erased. In his mind, her contribution had a zero balance. She stood up, her movements slow and deliberate. She walked over to her easel, where the portrait of the younger, hopeful Julian still stood, covered by a white sheet. She didn't say a word. She simply looked at the shrouded painting, then back at the stranger standing by the window. "Fine," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Have your lawyer send the papers." Julian looked relieved, almost giddy. The final obstacle to his new life had crumbled with barely a whisper of protest. He had expected a war. Instead, he got a surrender. He saw it as weakness, as a confirmation that he was right to discard her. He had no idea that her silence wasn't weakness. It was a judgment. The offices of Marcus Thorne Esker were a monument to aggressive litigation. Located on the 45th floor of the Prudential Tower, the space was a symphony of chrome black leather and glass, offering a panoramic view of a city that Julian felt he was on the verge of conquering. Thorne himself was a reflection of his environment, sharp, expensive, and with the predatory stillness of a shark. Julian sat on one side of the vast mahogany table, radiating impatience. He checked his Patek Philippe watch every few minutes. He had a lunch meeting with a potential investor from Bain Capital. This divorce was just an administrative task he needed to clear from his schedule. Emily sat opposite him, accompanied only by a court-appointed legal aide, a young, earnest woman named Sarah who looked thoroughly intimidated by the setting. Emily, by contrast, seemed utterly unfazed. She was dressed in a simple gray dress, her long brown hair tied back in a neat bun. She looked like a librarian who had taken a wrong turn and ended up in a corporate boardroom, yet she possessed a composure that was unnerving. Marcus Thorne cleared his throat, a sound like gravel being sifted. "Mrs. Croft, or soon-to-be Ms. Vance again." He began, a condescending smirk playing on his lips. "We have here the final divorce settlement. As you'll see, my client, Mr. Croft, has been exceptionally generous." He pushed a thick document across the table. Sarah, the legal aide, began to flip through it, her brow furrowed in concentration. Julian leaned forward. "Look, Ellie, let's just get this over with. I've given you what we discussed. The $50,000 you keep, the Honda, your personal items. Everything else, the penthouse, the investment portfolios, the art collection, the savings remains with me. It's a clean break. The business is mine, I built it. It's straightforward." Sarah looked up from the papers, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Mr. Thorne, this isn't a settlement, it's a capitulation. Under Massachusetts law, marital assets are to be divided equitably. Mrs. Croft is entitled to a significant portion of EtherTech's valuation, the value of this property, and substantial alimony. We're talking millions. $50,000 is an insult." Thorne chuckled a low, dismissive sound. "Your client was a librarian, not a business partner. EtherTech's success is a result of Mr. Croft's genius and hard work, period. We are prepared to argue in court that her contribution was negligible. A drawn-out legal battle will be unpleasant and expensive." He directed his gaze at Emily. "We'll dig into every aspect of your life. Are you sure you want that?" The threat was clear. They would paint her as a gold digger who contributed nothing, and they would use Julian's vast resources to bury her in legal fees until she was bankrupt. Julian added his own touch. "Don't be difficult, Emily. Take the deal. It's the smart play. You can't afford to fight me." All eyes turned to Emily. Sarah looked at her, pleading with her to let her fight. Julian looked at her with a mixture of pity and annoyance. Thorne looked at her with the confidence of a man who had never lost. Emily picked up the pen. Her hand was perfectly steady. She looked past Julian, past his lawyer, out the window at the sprawling city below. She had walked these streets with him when he had nothing but a dream. She had believed in that dream more than he did. And now, in this sterile room, that dream was being used as a weapon to erase her. She didn't look at the clauses divvying up their life. She didn't look at the paltry sum offered in exchange for her silence and her past. She didn't look at the man she had once loved. She simply turned to the last page and signed her name, Emily Vance. A collective breath was released in the room. Julian's relief was palpable. He stood up, smoothing down his suit jacket. "Good, that's settled. Marcus, send over the final confirmation." He didn't offer a handshake or a final word to Emily. He simply turned and walked out of the room, his phone already pressed to his ear, moving on to the next more important transaction. Marcus Thorne gathered his papers, a triumphant glint in his eye. He had won. Another easy, brutal victory. "My assistant will validate your parking, Ms. Vance." He said the formality, a final dismissive jab. Once they were gone, Sarah turned to Emily, her face a mask of frustration and bewilderment. "Why? Why would you do that? We could have fought. We could have gotten you a real settlement. You're entitled to so much more." Emily finally looked at the young lawyer, and for the first time a small, sad smile touched her lips. "Sometimes, Sarah," she said softly, her voice calm and clear, "the most valuable thing you can buy is your freedom. And today I bought mine for a very low price." She stood up, gathered her simple cloth bag, and walked out of the opulent office, leaving the world of Julian Croft behind her. As the elevator descended, she didn't feel loss or defeat. She felt a strange, quiet lightness. The weight of his ambition, of his judgment, of their decaying marriage was finally lifted. She moved into a small one-bedroom apartment in Cambridge, not far from Harvard Square. It was worlds away from the penthouse. The floors creaked, the heating was temperamental, and the view was of a brick wall. And she had never been happier. She filled the space with books, with canvases, with the smell of fresh coffee and the sound of classical music. She took on extra shifts at the library, finding comfort in the hushed, sacred atmosphere. Her old friends, the few who weren't merely Julian's contacts, called, bewildered. "Are you okay?" they'd ask. "We heard what he did. It's criminal." "I'm fine," Emily would reply. And the surprising thing was, she meant it. "I'm starting over." She was free. She had her books, her art, and her name. To everyone who knew the story, Emily Vance was a tragic figure, a fool who had let a rich, powerful man walk all over her. She had been given a choice between a fight and erasure, and she had chosen erasure. No one understood that in her silence she wasn't surrendering a fortune. She was reclaiming her soul. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, Emily had settled into a rhythm that felt like her own for the first time in years. Her life was small, but it was authentic. Her days were spent amidst the quiet dignity of the library, and her nights were lost in the vibrant chaos of her painting. She was working on a new series, Abstract Landscapes, inspired not by grand vistas but by the subtle textures of her new life. The crack in the pavement, the pattern of moss on an old brick wall, the way light filtered through the dusty window of her apartment. The summons came on a crisp autumn afternoon. It wasn't a court document, but a thick cream-colored envelope delivered by a courier. The embossed letterhead read, Cromwell, Sterling and Finch, a name synonymous with old money and impenetrable legal fortresses. Puzzled, Emily slid it open. The letter was brief and formal. It requested her presence at their New York City office at her earliest convenience regarding the estate of her maternal grandfather, Arthur Vance. Emily's heart seized. Arthur Vance. The name was a ghost from a life she had long since buried. He was a titan. A reclusive billionaire who had built his empire, Vance Global Holdings, in the shadowy, unglamorous worlds of industrial shipping and rare mineral mining. He was a man of iron will and rigid principles who lived in a sprawling, isolated estate in upstate New York. He was also the man who had disowned her. When Emily had announced her intention to marry Julian Croft, a charming, ambitious nobody with no family name and no money, Arthur had been apoplectic. He had summoned her to his Gothic mansion, a place that always smelled of old leather and disapproval. "This boy is a predator," Arthur had rasped, his eyes still sharp and intelligent at 85, boring into her. "He sees you not as a woman, but as a stepping stone. His ambition is a cancer. He will use you, and when you are no longer useful, he will discard you." "You don't know him, grandfather," Emily had argued, her voice trembling with defiance. "He loves me. We're building a life together." "You are a Vance," he had thundered. "You are the last of my line. You will not throw that away on a common grifter. End it, or you are no longer my granddaughter." Emily, blinded by love and a youthful desire to forge her own path, had chosen Julian. She had walked away from Arthur, from the Vance name, and from the suffocating weight of his expectations. In the 9 years since that day, they had not spoken a single word. He never acknowledged her existence, and she, out of pride and a genuine belief in the life she was building, never reached out. Now he was dead. A week later, she found herself in a wood-paneled office in Manhattan that looked more like a private club than a law firm. The man who greeted her was named Mr. Abernathy, a partner at the firm whose family had been managing the Vance estate for 3 generations. He was in his late 60s with a kind face and solemn eyes. "Ms. Vance," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "Thank you for coming. I was your grandfather's personal attorney, and I'd like to think his friend. I'm sorry for your loss." "To be honest, Mr. Abernathy, I lost him a long time ago," Emily said quietly. "I'm not even sure why I'm here. I assume there are some papers to sign, formalities." Mr. Abernathy folded his hands on his large desk. "Your grandfather was a complicated man, stubborn, proud. He never forgave easily. He watched your life from a distance, you know." This surprised Emily. "He did. He had a private investigator provide him with monthly reports." Abernathy confirmed. "He knew about your husband's company. He knew about its success. And he knew about the divorce." Emily felt a flush of shame. So her grandfather had seen his prediction come true. He had watched her get discarded just as he said she would. The divorce was finalized on May 12th. Abernathy continued consulting a file. "Your grandfather passed away on May 15th. The timing was startling. 3 days. "He made a change to his will on the morning of May 14th. Mr. Abernathy said, his voice dropping slightly. "A final change." He slid a heavy bond document across the desk. It was Arthur Vance's last will and testament. He had a previous will drafted the day after you married Mr. Croft. In it, he left his entire fortune to a variety of charitable trusts. You were explicitly written out." "I expected as much," Emily murmured. "This new will," Abernathy said, tapping the document, "renders that one null and void. He wrote it himself with me as a witness. He was lucid, and he was for the first time in 9 years quite clear about his intentions." He paused, letting the gravity of the moment settle in the silent room. "Ms. Vance," he said, looking her directly in the eye, "Arthur Vance has named you as the sole heir to his entire estate. This includes his liquid assets, his property portfolio, his art collection, and most significantly, his 100% controlling stake in Vance Global Holdings." Emily stared at him, the words failing to compute. It felt like he was speaking a foreign language. "Sole heir? That's not possible. He disowned me." "He saw that you had been stripped of everything," Abernathy explained gently. "And he saw that you walked away with your dignity. You didn't fight for the money. In his eyes, you proved you were not a Croft. You proved you were a Vance. His final words to me on the matter were, 'The boy took the gilding, but he left the gold behind. She's ready now.'" Emily's mind was reeling. She couldn't breathe. What does this all mean in practical terms?" Mr. Abernathy took off his glasses and polished them slowly. "In practical terms, Ms. Vance, your net worth as of the market's close yesterday is estimated to be slightly north of $200 million, and you are now the chairman and majority shareholder of a multinational corporation with over 5,000 employees." Emily Vance, the quiet librarian who lived in a creaky Cambridge apartment and worried about making rent, looked down at her hands. They were stained with a bit of ultramarine blue paint from the night before. She thought of the $50,000 Julian had so generously given her, a sum that now seemed like a cosmic joke. She thought of his condescending pity of his lawyer's sneer. She had walked out of that divorce with nothing but her name, and it turned out her name was worth everything. For 6 weeks the world remained unchanged. Emily, under the careful guidance of Mr. Abernathy and a team of financial advisors, began the dizzying process of understanding her new reality. She was flown on a private jet to her grandfather's estate, a place she hadn't seen since she was 22. She walked through the silent, cavernous rooms, now hers, feeling like an intruder. She met with the board of Vance Global Holdings, a group of stern-faced men who had been loyal to her grandfather for decades, and who now looked at her with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. Through it all, she insisted on one thing: absolute privacy. No press releases, no public announcements until she was ready. She continued to live in her Cambridge apartment and work her shifts at the library. It was her only anchor to sanity in a sea of overwhelming change. She needed to be Emily the librarian for just a little while longer before she was forced to become Emily Vance the heiress. The silence was officially broken by Forbes magazine. Despite the estate's best efforts, a story of this magnitude couldn't be contained forever. A journalist known for his deep dives into the world of old money pieced it together. The headline on their website, published on a crisp October morning, was simple and devastating. The reclusive titan, Arthur Vance's secret heir, is a Boston librarian. His granddaughter, Emily Vance, inherits 200 Memplus empire. The article was thorough. It detailed Arthur Vance's storied career, the immense and quiet power of his company, and the shocking third-act twist of his will. It mentioned his estrangement from his only granddaughter, and most pivotally, it mentioned her recent quiet divorce from rising tech CEO Julian Croft. The journalist didn't need to add commentary. The timeline told the entire story. She was divorced in May, left with next to nothing. Her grandfather died days later. She was now one of the wealthiest women in the country. The aftershock hit Julian Croft's world like a seismic event. He was in a board meeting presenting EtherTech's quarterly growth projections when his phone, set to silent, began vibrating incessantly on the table. It was his COO, his CFO, his PR head. He ignored them, annoyed at the interruption. Then Marcus Thorne, his lawyer, sent a text in all caps. "Call me now. It's an emergency." Julian excused himself, stepping into the hallway with a frown. "Marcus, I'm in a meeting. This had better be important." "Have you seen the news, Forbes?" Marcus's voice was strained, panicked. "No, what is it?" "It's Emily," Marcus said, the name sounding alien in his mouth. "Her grandfather was Arthur Vance, of Vance Global Holdings. He died, Julian. He left her everything." Julian's mind went blank. Vance. He vaguely remembered Emily mentioning a stubborn old grandfather, but she'd made him sound like some retired farmer, not a legendary tycoon. "What do you mean, everything?" "Everything means everything," Marcus hissed. "The company, the estate. Julian, the initial estimates are over $200 million. Julian felt the blood drain from his face. The sleek, air-conditioned hallway suddenly felt hot and tight. He leaned against the glass wall, his knuckles white as he gripped his phone. 200 million. The number was nonsensical. It was a rounding error in a nation's budget. It was more than the entire valuation of the company he had dedicated his life to building. His mind flashed back to the divorce meeting. Emily's calm face, her simple gray dress, her silence. He had seen it as weakness, as the quiet acceptance of a woman who knew her own worthlessness. He felt a wave of nausea. It wasn't weakness, it was contempt. She had sat there knowing this was a possibility and let him discard her for $50,000. She had watched him preen and posture secure in a secret that made his entire world look like a child's sandcastle. He ended the call and stumbled back into the boardroom. The faces of his investors and executives turned to him expectant. He opened his mouth to speak about projections and synergy, but all he could see was Emily's face at the signing table. The quiet dignity, the utter lack of fear, the pity in her eyes that he had mistaken for sadness. The news spread through the tech and finance circles of Boston like wildfire. At first it was just shock. Then it turned to a dark schadenfreude-laced humor. Julian Croft, the man who preached about vision, about seeing the next big thing, had been married to a golden goose and had traded her in for a pittance. He wasn't a visionary, he was the biggest fool in the history of venture capital. That evening he was at a cocktail party with Savannah. The mood was different. The usual fawning sycophants were keeping their distance, watching him from afar, whispering behind their hands. Savannah, who had been ecstatic about the Forbes mention of her as Julian's new powerful partner, was now tense and irritable. "I can't believe you didn't know," she said through a clenched jaw, sipping her champagne. "How could you be married to someone for 8 years and not know her family was sitting on a fortune? She was estranged from them." "She never said a word," he snapped back, his voice raw. "Well, maybe you should have asked," Savannah retorted. "God, Julian, this is a PR nightmare. It makes you look incompetent. It makes us look like a joke." He saw it then, the calculation in her eyes, the brand alignment. He hadn't just divorced Emily, he had divorced a dynasty, and in doing so he had fundamentally damaged his own brand. The mystique of Julian Croft, the infallible golden boy, was shattered. All that was left was a greedy man who had made the worst deal of his life. He felt a cold dread creep into his heart. He hadn't just lost a fortune, he was about to lose everything. The fallout was swift and brutal. An investor who had been on the cusp of leading EtherTech's Series B funding round suddenly went cold, citing a shift in market confidence. Whispers followed Julian down the hallways of his own company. His authority, once absolute, now seemed hollow. He had built his reputation on being 10 steps ahead of everyone else, and the revelation that he'd been so spectacularly blindsided in his own home eroded the very foundation of his mythos. Desperation began to set in. He saw his future, the IPO, the magazine covers, the legacy slipping through his fingers. And it all led back to one person, Emily. He became obsessed. He tried calling her, but her number had been disconnected. He drove by her old apartment in Cambridge, but the landlord said she'd moved out weeks ago, leaving no forwarding address. He was locked out, a ghost from a past she had completely excised. Finally, through a private investigator of his own, he found the address of the newly formed Vance Foundation in a discreet, elegant brownstone on Beacon Hill. This was his chance. He had to fix this. He convinced himself that their love had been real, that he had just been temporarily blinded by ambition. He could win her back. He had to. He showed up unannounced on a Wednesday afternoon. He was dressed meticulously in his most expensive suit, clutching a bouquet of lilies, Emily's favorite, that now felt absurdly inadequate. The interior of the foundation was nothing like he expected. It wasn't opulent. It was tasteful and serene, with walls adorned not with famous art, but with the vibrant, promising work of unknown artists. A polite but firm assistant told him that Ms. Vance was in a meeting. Julian, using the last dregs of his once powerful charm, insisted it was a personal emergency. Reluctantly, the assistant led him to a spacious office overlooking a private garden, and there she was. Emily. She was not the mousy librarian he remembered. She stood tall, dressed in a simple but impeccably tailored navy blue dress. Her hair was down, falling in soft waves over her shoulders. She was meeting with two young artists, discussing their work with an easy confidence he had never seen in her. The transformation was staggering. It wasn't the clothes or the setting. It was an aura of quiet power, of self-possession. She didn't look like a different person. She looked like the person she was always meant to be. She saw him, and her smile faded, replaced by a cool, neutral expression. She politely excused herself from the meeting and gestured for him to sit. The artist filed out, giving Julian a curious glance. "Julian," she said, her voice even. "This is a surprise. To what do I owe this visit?" He set the flowers down on her desk. They looked garish and out of place. Emily, I've been trying to reach you. I was so worried." A small, incredulous laugh escaped her lips. "Worried? You weren't worried when you left me with $50,000 in a 10-year-old Honda Julian. What's changed?" "Everything's changed," he said, his voice cracking with manufactured emotion. "I heard about your grandfather. I am so sorry for your loss, and I'm sorry for everything else. I was a fool. I was drowning in the pressure of the company of that world. I lost myself. I lost us." He moved closer, his eyes pleading. "It was never about Savannah. She was a distraction, a symptom of the disease of my ambition. The man you married is still in here, the man who loved you in that tiny apartment with nothing but our dreams. We can find that again." Emily listened to his performance without interruption. Her calmness was more unsettling than any shouting match could have ever been. When he was finished, a long silence stretched between them. "Do you know what my grandfather did after he learned we were getting married?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Julian was thrown. "What? No." "He hired a firm to do a complete background check on you. A real one, not just your credit score. He sent a man posing as a potential investor to meet with you. This investor offered you a deal seed funding for your own venture, a guaranteed position, a shortcut to everything you wanted. The only condition was that you had to sign an NDA and relocate to Singapore, alone." Julian's face went pale. He remembered the meeting. A man named Mr. Peterson. The offer had been incredibly tempting, coming at a time when he and Emily were struggling. "You turned him down," Emily continued, her eyes like chips of ice. "You told my grandfather's man that you were committed to your fiancée. My grandfather was almost impressed. He thought maybe he'd misjudged you. So he authorized the man to make a second offer for 10 times the money. All you had to do was leave me." She let the unspoken question hang in the air. Julian couldn't meet her eyes. He remembered the second offer. He remembered agonizing over it for a week, the temptation eating him alive. "You told him you needed to think about it," Emily said, finishing the story for him. "You didn't say no, Julian. You weighed my worth against a number, and you hesitated. That was all my grandfather needed to know. He saw the predator in you then, and he was right. It just took me 8 more years to see it too." The carefully constructed hope in Julian's face crumbled into raw, ugly despair. He was exposed. There was no charm, no excuse that could cover this. The money, Emily. The divorce settlement. He stammered, his true motivation finally laid bare. It's not right. You're entitled to half of my assets, but by that same token I should be entitled to... Entitled? She cut him off, her voice ringing with steel. You are entitled to nothing. You made your deal. You traded 8 years of marriage for a clean break and $50,000. You set the price, Julian, not me. I just accepted your terms. She stood up, the finality of the gesture clear. The woman you divorced is gone. The life we had is gone. You burned that bridge to the ground. You just didn't realize until now that the other side was where all the gold was. Emily, please. He begged, his voice now a pathetic whisper. Don't do this. The meeting is over, she said, her voice softening with a finality that was more painful than anger. I wish you well, Julian. Truly. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, but you will not find it here. Please see yourself out. She turned away from him and looked out the window at her garden, a silent dismissal. Julian Croft stood for a moment, a man utterly defeated. The flowers sat on the desk between them, already starting to wilt. He turned and walked out of the foundation, out of her life. A king who had just realized he'd willingly given away his entire kingdom for a handful of shiny pebbles. Julian's retreat from the Vance Foundation was not just a walk of shame. It was the beginning of his complete unraveling. Emily's story about her grandfather's test played on a loop in his mind. It recontextualized his entire life. His success felt fraudulent, his ambition pathetic. He had always seen himself as a master strategist, a player of the long game. Now he knew the truth. He had been a pawn in a game so large he hadn't even been aware he was playing. The world he had built, EtherTech, began to fracture. The story of his divorce, once just gossip, was now a business legend, a cautionary tale about greed and spectacular misjudgment. Investors grew wary. If Croft's judgment was so flawed in his personal life, how could they trust his vision for the company? His employees, who had once revered him, now looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. The energy in the office, once electric with possibility, became sluggish and fearful. His relationship with Savannah Sterling was the next casualty. She was a creature of power and perception, and Julian was now radiating weakness. Their arguments became more frequent and vicious. The B-round funding is falling apart, Julian, she yelled at him one night in the penthouse that now felt like a gilded cage. My contacts are avoiding my calls. Your mess is starting to stick to me. So it's all about you. He shot back, his nerves frayed. You never gave a damn about me, only about what being with me could do for your career. Of course it's about my career, she admitted with shocking candor. Just like it was about yours. That was the deal. We were a power couple, but you're not powerful anymore. You're a punchline. I can't be with a punchline. She left a week later. There was no tearful goodbye, just a note on the kitchen island and an empty space in the closet where her designer clothes used to be. She was seen 2 weeks after that on the arm of a rival tech CEO, laughing at a charity gala. She had upgraded just as Julian once had. The symmetry was poetic in its cruelty. With his personal life in shambles, Julian threw himself into saving his company. He worked 18-hour days fueled by caffeine and desperation. But he was making mistakes. He pushed his team too hard, made risky financial bets, and alienated key partners with his increasingly erratic and aggressive behavior. He was trying to force the company's valuation to a point where he could prove to the world and to himself that he didn't need Emily or her family's money. The final blow came from within. A group of his senior engineers, disillusioned with his leadership and poached by a competitor, resigned en masse. They were the heart of EtherTech's innovation. Without them, the company's proprietary algorithm was just a ghost in the machine. The news leaked and the company's value plummeted. The Series B funding didn't just fall apart, it evaporated. Within 6 months of the Forbes article, Julian was forced by his board to step down as CEO. He retained a small portion of his stock, now worth a fraction of its peak value. The penthouse was sold to cover the company's debts. He who had once stood at the pinnacle of Boston's elite found himself renting a small, sterile apartment in a corporate complex in the suburbs, a place with no character and no history. One evening, sitting alone amidst his packed boxes, he saw a news segment on television. It was about the Vance Foundation's first major initiative, a multi-million-dollar grant to digitize and preserve the Boston Public Library's entire rare books collection. There was Emily speaking to the press. She was articulate, poised, and passionate. She spoke of the importance of preserving history, of making knowledge accessible to everyone. She looked happy. She looked fulfilled. She looked like she hadn't thought about him in months. He was nothing to her, not a source of anger, not a regret, not even a memory. He was just a line item in her past, a closed chapter in a book she had long since finished reading. The $50,000 he had given her felt like the most pathetic and ironic gesture in human history. He had tried to buy her silence and compliance, and instead he had paid a pittance for his own damnation. He finally understood the full scope of his loss. It wasn't just the $200 million. He had lost the woman who had believed in him before anyone else, the one person who had loved the man, not the CEO. And he had traded her for an empire of glass that was now shattered at his feet. A year after the divorce, the name Julian Croft had faded into a cautionary anecdote told over drinks in Boston's financial district. EtherTech had been acquired for its assets at a bargain basement price by a larger competitor, its name and vision absorbed and erased. Julian, having lost his board seat, his fortune, and his fiancée, had disappeared from the public eye. He lived in a soulless beige apartment complex in a town he'd once mocked as the suburbs, a place for people whose ambitions had died. One rainy Tuesday evening, while eating a microwave dinner, he saw her on a national news program. It was a segment on modern philanthropy. There was Emily, not in a boardroom, but in a brightly lit public library surrounded by children. She was announcing the Vance Foundation's latest initiative, a multi-million-dollar grant to establish mobile libraries to service underprivileged rural communities. She was poised, articulate, and radiated a calm, purposeful energy. Julian watched the plastic fork halfway to his mouth and felt a profound, hollow emptiness. It wasn't just regret for the lost money. It was the chilling realization that she had built a world of meaning and substance, while his had been a house of cards built on ego. He was no longer even the villain in her story. He was an irrelevant, forgotten prologue. He turned off the television and sat in the silent gray darkness. Emily's world, in contrast, was saturated with color and life. The Vance Foundation became a celebrated institution not for the size of its endowment, but for the intelligence and heart with which it was run. Emily had found her true calling not as a CEO, but as a cultivator of art, of knowledge, of human potential. She sold her grandfather's oppressive Gothic estate and the sterile penthouse, divesting herself of the ghosts of men who had tried to define her. She bought a beautiful, rambling 19th-century home in Cambridge, one with ivy-covered walls, overflowing bookshelves, and a large, airy studio with a wall of north-facing windows that flooded the room with perfect, consistent light. It was a space for living and creating, not for performing or impressing. Her art, now untethered from expectation or financial need, underwent a breathtaking evolution. It became her primary language. Her first solo show in a prestigious Soho gallery was the talk of the New York art scene. It was titled simply, The Silent Agreement. The gallery was packed on opening night, a humming ecosystem of critics, collectors, and artists. At the heart of the exhibition hung a massive diptych that commanded the room. The left panel was a claustrophobic vision of cold metallic grays and sharp angular lines that seemed to compress the space, evoking the feeling of a gilded cage. The right panel was its antithesis, an explosive, soaring composition of warm, vibrant colors, deep ultramarine cadmium yellow and fiery orange that suggested boundless freedom and light. It was a raw, abstract autobiography. It was there, standing quietly in a corner and observing the crowd, that she was approached by a man. He wasn't one of the slick collectors or fawning critics. He had a tweed jacket, thoughtful eyes, behind wire-rimmed glasses, and a dusting of gray at his temples. He was Dr. Ben Carter, a history professor from Columbia University who had been drawn in by the exhibit's catalog. "Forgive me for interrupting," he began, his voice a warm baritone. "I was just struck by the title of your centerpiece, The Silent Agreement. It implies a contract. From the looks of the left panel, the terms were rather brutal." Emily, used to people asking about price or technique, was pleasantly surprised by his perception. "The terms were that one person got everything and the other person got to keep their soul," she replied, a small smile playing on her lips. "A bargain at any price, then," he said, his eyes twinkling. He had no idea she was the artist, let alone the subject of a famous financial scandal. He just saw the work and understood it on a deeply human level. Their conversation flowed effortlessly from the emotional resonance of her art to his own passion, the history of illuminated manuscripts. They discovered a shared love for the tangible past, for the stories held in paper and paint. He didn't see an heiress or a socialite. He saw a fellow scholar, a kindred spirit whose hands like his were often stained with ink and pigment. Their relationship grew as organically as the wild roses in her new garden. It was built in the quiet aisles of libraries, over cups of coffee in dusty Cambridge bookshops, and during long walks along the Charles River, the city skyline a distant glittering thing that no longer held any power over her. Ben visited her studio often, sitting for hours just to watch her paint. He understood that this was her sacred space, the place where she processed the world and translated it into her own unique language. With him, she felt seen in a way she never had with Julian. Ben wasn't interested in her brand or her trajectory. He was fascinated by the intricate, beautiful landscape of her mind. One late summer evening, they sat together in her garden as fireflies began to stitch the twilight. The air was fragrant with the scent of lavender and damp earth. "I've been thinking about your show's title," Ben said, breaking a comfortable silence. "The Silent Agreement. When you were going through all of that, did you feel like you were losing by staying quiet?" Emily looked up at the first stars pricking the deepening indigo sky. She considered the question, the memory of that cold boardroom no longer carrying a sting. "For a long time I did," she confessed. "I thought my silence was weakness, a failure to fight for what I was owed. I was surrounded by people who believed power was about shouting the loudest, about taking the most, and I just signed the paper." She paused, then turned to him, her expression clear and certain. "But I've come to understand it differently. It wasn't a surrender. It was a refusal to participate. Julian's world, his whole system, was based on a certain definition of value, market share, stock price, net worth. Fighting him on his terms would have meant accepting that his definition was the right one. My silence wasn't an agreement to his terms. It was the quietest, most powerful rejection of his entire worldview." Ben listened, his gaze full of warmth and understanding. "I wasn't giving up my share of a fortune," she continued, a note of wonder in her own voice as she articulated the thought. "I was protecting the only thing that was truly mine, my integrity. The person I was when I had nothing. That's the woman my grandfather finally saw. That's the woman I finally reclaimed for myself." She reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing with his. "So no," she said, her voice clear and strong over the gentle hum of the cicadas. "I didn't feel like I was losing. I see it now. My silence was never the price I had to pay. It was the shrewdest investment I ever made, and it has paid off more beautifully than I could have ever imagined." Emily Vance's story isn't just about a shocking inheritance or a husband's karmic downfall. It's a powerful testament to the idea that true worth is never determined by a bank account or by someone else's validation. Julian Croft saw his wife's quiet nature as a weakness he needed to shed, but he was blind to the immense strength and integrity that lay beneath. In her silence, Emily wasn't surrendering. She was waiting. She was holding on to the one thing he could never take from her, her own identity. Her story is a reminder that the loudest person in the room is not always the most powerful, and that sometimes the greatest victories are won not with a shout, but with the quiet, dignified act of walking away and building a better life on your own terms. What did you think of Emily's incredible journey? Do you believe Julian got what he deserved? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you were moved by this story of hidden strength and ultimate vindication, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe for more true life stories that will leave you speechless. Thank you for watching.